Economic wisdom. We should avoid becoming involved in economic agreements that will interfere with biblical priorities. Here's Gene to explain.
Solomon was very concerned about financial entanglements, and that's exactly what we see right from the very beginning of chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. In fact, I've entitled these verses, Financial Entanglements. My son, and of course he's speaking all the way through here, very personally to his son. My son, if you have put up security for your neighbor or entered into an agreement with a stranger, you have been trapped by the words of your lips, ensnared by the words of your mouth. Now, you'll notice that there's even progression here in these verses because he mentions security for your neighbor, someone you know, but then he talks about an agreement with a stranger, which can be even worse in terms of financial entanglements and getting ourselves into difficult problems. He continues in verses 3 to 5, "Do this then, my son, and free yourself, for you have put yourself in your neighbor's power. Go, humble yourself, and plead with your neighbor. Don't give sleep to your eyes or slumber to your eyelids." And then notice he uses some pretty powerful similes here. Escape like a gazelle from a hunter. Escape like a bird from a fowler's trap. In other words, this is serious stuff. He's warning, don't get involved in financial entanglements. Now, to interpret these statements, we have to understand the cultural setting. We have to understand the unique historical background because Solomon is thinking of the Israelites, but he's thinking of the Israelites in a particular moment in history. You see, when God chose Israel, beginning with Abraham, of course, and Abraham gave birth to Isaac, Isaac then to Jacob, and then to the 12 tribes, God made some very wonderful promises to the children of Israel. And we have those outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 6. I've simply called them economic promises. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he would give you. Now remember, even when God chose Abraham out of idolatry, he said, I'm going to give you a land. And that promise was reiterated for Abraham's son and sons, grandson. And so here is a reiteration of this by Moses before the children of Israel to go into the land of Israel. They're perched on the land. They're ready to cross the Jordan after having wandered in the wilderness because of their sins. So Moses said, a land with large and beautiful cities that you did not build, houses full of every good thing that you did not fill them with, wells dug that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. And then here, of course, is a very serious warning to the children of Israel. And when you eat and are satisfied, be careful not to forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Fear Yahweh your God, worship him, and take your oaths in his name. Now, God made them a promise that they were going to be basically a self-contained culture. God was going to take care of them. God was going to bless them. But the fact of the matter is, these promises that he said about taking care of them were conditional. And he reiterates this when you get into Deuteronomy chapter 28. Here are the conditions for God to continue to meet your needs, speaking to the children of Israel through Moses. All these blessings will come and overtake you because you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. Your descendants will be blessed, and your land's produce, and the offspring of your livestock, including the young of your herds and the newborn of your flocks. Your basket and kneading bowl will be blessed. You'll be blessed when you come in, and you'll be blessed when you go out. Now, these were great blessings and promises if indeed the children of Israel obeyed God's laws. The fact of the matter is, they disobeyed. And so Moses addressed that even before they disobeyed, because here are the curses for disobedience. But if you do not obey the Lord your God by carefully following all his commands and statutes I'm giving you today, all these curses will come and overtake you. And if I would give you those verses, if you go to this passage, you will see that he reiterates the curses. The blessings will not be in the city, the country, and the land, and the herds, and the flocks. It'll just be the opposite. You'll lose all of those blessings. Now, unfortunately, the children of Israel inherited the curses because they disobeyed the Lord. And this makes Solomon's statements even more important in relationship to how they obligate themselves to a neighbor, but particularly to a stranger. In fact, we see an example of this when the children of Israel came back from Babylonian captivity, even after they experienced the judgment because of their sins being carried into a foreign land. They came back and God was reestablishing them back in the land. And when Nehemiah came to help them, he discovered tremendous social injustice in terms of taking advantage of each other. We read about this in Nehemiah 5, where Nehemiah has to address this issue. Here's what is recorded, and Nehemiah is reflecting. Still others were saying, we have borrowed money to pay the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. You see, the fact of the matter is now they're still in domination by the pagan kings around them. They don't have the freedom that they once had back in the land of Israel when they first inherited it. We and our children are just like our countrymen and their children, yet we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. Now, they're talking about slavery because of their indebtedness even to each other. He goes on to share and explain that. Some of our daughters are already enslaved. To whom? To their fellow Israelites. I mean, this is the system of worldliness that has taken over their lives even after they have come back from Babylonian captivity. And these people who are experiencing this is what they said. We're powerless. We're powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. You see, Solomon is warning against this kind of situation within Israel. Perhaps prophetically, maybe he didn't realize the extent to which he was going to speak prophetic statements about the entanglements, the financial entanglements that will bring them down and cause them to experience the very things that Solomon said, get out of that situation as quickly as you can. Don't get into that kind of bondage. So that helps us to understand, I think, some of the Proverbs and what are stated about financial entanglements. When we come to the New Testament, we have a different perspective. We have similar concepts, but we have a different perspective. And Paul outlined this perspective when he wrote to the Romans, chapter 13. Pay your obligations to everyone, taxes to those you owe taxes. Now let me just underscore that. I've heard some Christians say, I'm not going to pay my taxes to the government because I don't agree with the way they're using my money. I don't agree with the fact that they're using my money illegally, immorally, and even unethically. Therefore, I'm not obligated to pay my taxes. Well, keep in mind, Paul is writing to Christians in the Roman Empire whose leaders were evil in ways that we have never experienced it in our culture or society. When you think of Nero, you think in the way in which the Roman emperors used the money from taxes. And yet Paul said, pay taxes to those you owe taxes. because ultimately they're responsible under God for the way they use it. Now, in our culture, of course, we have opportunities and freedoms to vote in ways that they didn't have in the Roman Empire. But the fact is, Paul said, pay your obligations to everyone. Taxes to those you owe taxes, tolls to those you owe tolls, respect to those you owe respect. And there, I believe he's indicating we do have to have respect for those in leadership, because God has ordained leadership. We may not agree with them, but we're to respect the office, respect the position. And honor to those you owe honor. Do not owe anyone anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Now again, there are Christians that misinterpret this statement, do not owe anyone anything. And if you look at the totality of the Scriptures, this is not teaching that it's wrong to borrow money. This is not teaching that even co-signing a note is a violation of the will of God. There are cautions, because if you co-sign for someone, as someone told me one time, if you co-sign for a fellow believer, you better be ready to pay it if that person is not able to repay it. And that makes you stop and think, because anyone who asks you to co-sign something should be very sure, as much as possible, that they can repay that. But they should do so cautiously. I think these are guidelines that we have in Scripture. Some of these guidelines, here are the guidelines I think that are in place or should be in place when we borrow money. We should always make financial decisions based on our ability to assume all obligations without violating biblical priorities, such as, number one, to me this is an important New Testament priority, being able to continue to give to the Lord's work regularly and generously. If we're making a decision to borrow money, one of the guidelines should be, how is this going to affect my ability to put God first in my giving? If my obligation to the bank or some other place crowds out my ability to give to the Lord, as God has prospered, then I think we need to think twice about borrowing money. That's a guideline. We don't want to make God second. Because once we borrow, then we're obligated to pay taxes, tolls, interest, whatever. We're obligated to pay it back. And so if we're not careful, we can get caught between, in a sense, our obligation to the Lord, which He wants freely, or our obligation to man. So we have to be careful about that. Secondly, I think we have to be very cautious about providing for our families. Obviously, that we don't want to do anything that is unwise that would keep us from putting our families first and taking care of our families. Paul was very strict about that, very specific. He said, if you can't take care of your own family, then you're worse than an unbeliever. So that's a very important priority. So that's a guideline that helps us to make decisions. And then finally, meeting other financial commitments. Because the Bible teaches with this passage is that we have financial commitments, we're to pay those financial commitments. If we have a loan, there's going to be an agreement. And we don't owe until the payment is due. But if we're not able to make the payments according to the agreement, then we owe. We owe and we need to pay. So here is a reflection and response question. Why is it that so many Christians get themselves into economic agreements that violate biblical priorities? Well, let me just share a couple of things. Number one is, I think, we get caught up in materialism. We get caught up trying to keep up with other people. And we have to be very, very careful of that. because that can get us into difficulty, even as believers. Another thing is we take risks that are inappropriate. We're not thinking through what can happen. I just talked with a doctor friend recently. He's about my age and a very successful guy. Made a lot of money in his early years of practice, but during an economic boom when the whole area of buildings was strong, he took all of his savings and put it into those buildings, into real estate. And the real estate market crashed. And those buildings never functioned properly and never generated the income that he had hoped. And to this day, he's still working to overcome the problem that he created way back years before by taking everything that he had in his savings and putting it into real estate. And he would say to you, as he said to me, that was a risk I should never have taken. It was stupid. It was wrong. And he said, I should have listened to wisdom. And that leads to another point. We neglect good counsel. And we really need to have good counsel when it comes to borrowing money. I remember the first time Elaine and I borrowed some money from an uncle that could really afford to help us in a particular situation. It was an investment that we thought was going to work out well, but boy, did he put me to the test. He asked every question in the book. And finally, he wrote out a check. And to be honest with you, I think he wrote out the check thinking he'd never get it back. But I remember Elaine and I immediately made that a priority to pay off that debt, immediately. So we would never renege. In fact, we wanted to pay it off before it was due. But I'm so thankful for those questions. It really made me think. And by the way, it wasn't such a great investment, after all. Would I do it again? Probably not. But the fact is that when it comes to financial involvement, we need counsel. Good counsel. So here's the principle to live by. We should avoid becoming involved in economic agreements that will interfere with biblical priorities.